All right, welcome to the Friday edition of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm by myself today. I normally am joined on Mondays and Wednesdays by Sumer Sports CEO and former Falcons GM Thomas Dimitroff. This past couple weeks, we've been on a little bit. There's just been a lot to do, right? There's just been a lot to do business-wise. There's been a lot to do from a basically like a sports analytics side where some Fridays I can do the show, some Fridays I can't. Today I'm going to do the show. We're going to get out of here in probably about 40 minutes just because there are other meetings to attend to. But I'm excited to talk this afternoon about Week 10. Just a brief kind of come back to yesterday where the Chicago Bears beat the Carolina Panthers. Game opened 3, got to 3.5 and 4, closed at 3. Game landed 3, so a good outcome for people who ended up taking the best of it with the Carolina Panthers, and if you got the best of it with the Bears, at least you got away with it with a push. Just a couple things to talk about here. I'm going to add here the Eagers Football Fridays, Week 10. I talk about a few things on this particular article. I talk a little bit about the running back position where we've seen and we saw it last night as well, where offenses haven't been particularly embarrassing this year, but the running games have not been up to snuff. You saw that with at least Carolina. D'Onta Foreman was fine last night, but not a ton of scoring there. The thing I'm buying is the picture of that guy, Kevin O'Connell. I'm buying him for Coach of the Year. He's been one of sort of the best coaches as far as looking at in-game win probability added. When you look at punching above his weight class with respect to the players that they have, I think so far this season he has been the NFL Coach of the Year. And then a thing I'm selling is, and this was a good, I actually got this from my colleague Tej Seth because I was struggling to think of things to sell. He talked about kind of this idea that the NFL wasn't as exciting this year, and he thought that was a little bit premature. Excitement index from this year is down relative to last year, but it's been historically on par with what we've seen over the past few years. Shout out to Luke Benz, who created the excitement index a few years back to help us sort of understand, sort of how kind of games are going from a win probability standpoint and so forth. Last but not least, sumersports.com. Go there, sign up, hit subscribe to the newsletter. If you are looking for an introductory text for Football Analytics, our book, Football Analytics in Python and R, by myself and Richard Erickson, it is on sale at Amazon. I believe, actually, you can get 3 for the price of 2 now, which is a very good deal. If you are somebody who is an educator, if you reach out to me, more than happy to give a lecture to supplement that book. We're going to get people sort of coming into the chat here. I did say on Twitter that this would start at 3. I scheduled it on YouTube at 3:30, so we might end up getting a few stragglers. That's okay. As far as live is concerned, it's not that big of a deal to me. Hopefully we get the normal suspects in to talk about the NFL. I'm not going to talk about every single game here because I don't have all the whole time. I will talk for sake of completeness on the London game where the Indianapolis Colts, depending upon where you look, 2.5 point favorites against New England in Germany. This is one where you look at the total as well. The total for this game is 43.5. So not of the big variety as far as totals, but also not in like the 30s that you've grown accustomed to expect during the course of the season. No J.C. Jackson, he was left behind. Patriots kind of reeling from a defensive standpoint, but still only gave up 20 last week to a Washington Commanders team that frankly has got decent quarterback play from Sam Howell. Gardner Minshew is somebody who I think is probably of Howell's caliber. So, if I'm looking at this game, I think the only place that you can look, for example, would be, under and under 21.5, probably first half is someplace where I'd look. A lot of these games are just simply dying on the vine here, and it's incredible to see. Even games that start out, for example, Chiefs scored 21 in the first half. The last Frankfurt game scored 0 in the second. One of my friends, that goes by Hitman, had over in that Sunday night football game, 21 points in the first quarter. I remember messaging the group saying, I can't wait to see how this goes under. That has just been the way of the world. That has just been the way of the world, basically, this entire season, where you get, games that start out pretty hot, and then you get kind of both teams being able to like drive the ball to midfield and punt or even miss fourth downs. But because of the ability of these teams to move the football, it just takes a lot of time off the clock. And so any total in the 40s is going to be difficult for me to examine. And speaking of that, let's talk about a game that's at 425. Washington is going to Seattle. Seattle is anywhere from 5.5 to 6 point favorites in this game. This is one that was hotly contested on a few of the shows that I've gone on. Total got as high as 46 and a half, if I'm not mistaken, all the way down to 44. I know some really, really smart people who like under in that game. But at 44, you have to really ask, like, that's, you've seen some market resistance. You've seen some places get up to 45 now. Anytime it's gotten into that 44 range, you've seen market resistance. So I think if you were able to get the best of it at 46 and a half, that was probably a good play. Sam Howell is good enough to move the ball, up and down the field, but I don't necessarily know if he's good enough to convert those into touchdowns every time. And we know the Seattle Seahawks have had the characteristics of a team that's able to move the ball up and down the field, but not score, and that has been an ingredient for unders in the NFL. So that was a look that a lot of people have been talking about all week. The other one that I think has been interesting is San Francisco at Jacksonville, both teams off of a bye. We saw this thing open up at about 2.5 and get to 3. And it's basically stuck at 3 this entire time. You can get a very cheap 3 depending upon where you look. In theory, the 49ers should be healthy off of a bye. That means Samuel. That means Trent Williams. It still not necessarily out of the woods. As far as Trent Williams is concerned, but you are getting healthier there. Brock Purdy a week to sort of lick his wounds after a few tough ones from the interception standpoint. Although I thought he played fine against the Bengals. You look to the other side, like this has been the exact kind of opposite that you've expected to see from the Jacksonville Jaguars. On offense, you've seen some struggles. You've seen some offensive linemen either injured or out with gambling suspensions. You've seen Trevor Lawrence not necessarily, be the superstar player that people expected him to. If you go to sumersports.com/players/quarterbacks, when you look at Trevor Lawrence from an EPA perspective, he's negative 3.4 this season. He's behind players like Joe Burrow, Jordan Love, Anthony Richardson, Russell Wilson, Matthew Stafford, Baker Mayfield, Jared Goff, if you're looking for total EPA. So this team, which I think many people expected, bringing in Calvin Ridley, they did move off of Jawan Taylor, but they basically replaced him with Anton Harrison. People expected the offense to emerge and be very good in year 2 of Doug Peterson. But it hasn't been that way. The defense has been great, a top 5 group in terms of EPA per play allowed. And that to me brings up like the biggest thing. Like if you like Jacksonville +3 in this game, you believe that the likes of Foye Oluokun, who Thomas and I talked about in the podcast Wednesday, one of Thomas Dimitrov's draft picks, you think that Foye Oluokun and Devin Lloyd, the first-round pick out of Utah, are both going to be able to make enough plays on Christian McCaffrey to mitigate that. McCaffrey's been not necessarily a very efficient runner, especially relative to expectations since the oblique injury. You hope that they can make a play on him off of a bye where he's getting a little bit healthier, also neutralize the tight ends and neutralize Kyle Juszczyk. And then the corners who have been pretty good this year, but not necessarily tested as much as people think, to keep up with Brandon Ayuk, who's the second most efficient wide receiver in the NFL, as well as Deebo Samuel and George Kittle, who has come on at times. Like I don't make this number 3. I guess from a number standpoint, I'd like Jacksonville, but there's a lot of wins in the direction of San Francisco, including the number moving, which is evidence that at least some smart people are taking San Francisco. So that's a game I think to monitor. I think it should be a really good game in a game full of or a week full of games that are kind of not necessarily that interesting. I'm going to speak about another one that's not necessarily that interesting, but it's between two teams with winning records in the NFC. The New Orleans Saints at 5-4 go to Minnesota. Minnesota is anywhere from a 3 -115 to a -2.5. I think similarly -115 -110 if you look at Caesars. An underdog here. Josh Dobbs is a great story. The Vikings went on the road last week. I was at that game with Sean Clement at Sumer. I was very impressed with Kevin O'Connell. How he, no pre-snap penalties or anything like that with Josh Dobbs in there. The Vikings are second in the NFL, only to Jacksonville, by the way, in penalty net EPA, meaning they're committing fewer penalties and having like sort of fewer high leverage penalties than their opponent is. And for the Vikings, it's, about 4 touchdowns worth. And so, whereas you look at New Orleans has gotten a lot of turnovers, including last week. But turnovers that, you got turnovers and, you barely beat a Bears team that you were almost double-digit favorites to. Can't cover the number, kind of controlled the game, but, did let Tyson Bagent get some play on them. The hard part about me for this game is, again, I think that +3 is probably a good look for Minnesota. The only issue is that, Josh Dobbs is a good story. And I think it ends there. Like when you look at Dobbs from an efficiency standpoint, now some of this you have to talk about with, the fact that he's playing, for guys like Arizona, he's playing for guys like Minnesota. But Josh Dobbs, you're talking about a guy from an EPA per play perspective that's far into negative territory. And he's closer to guys like Desmond Ridder, Mac Jones, Ryan Tannehill, Jimmy Garoppolo than he is some of the better players in the league. And so, this gets back to the question, for example, it'll come up with a guy like CJ Stroud. Is CJ Stroud good for a rookie or is he good in general? I think for Dobbs, you have to ask the very real question is he good for the story or is he good kind of independent? Like, is he better than even the story? And I would say that Josh Dobbs is probably a better story than he is a quarterback. So that's, that's something that I don't necessarily know if I want to back into, but I can't lay points with the Saints on the road. This is not, I just not impressed with the Saints from a decision-making standpoint, not impressed with the Saints at the quarterback position. They can't seem to get Chris Olave, who's one of the better young wide receivers in football. They can't seem to get him happy as far as, volume of targets and things like that. Alvin Kamara has become less and less a part of this offense as guys like Jamal Williams have come back. So the Saints, to me, are very I think this is a matchup of 2 5-4 teams. One team is 5-4 despite, I think, a lot of, 5-4 when they should be more like 7-3. If you look at the schedule, Saints have the easiest schedule moving forward, one of the easiest schedules up until this point. The Saints should be better from a record standpoint. The Vikings shouldn't and are. And so I do, want to know, like, how much can they really squeeze the juice out of the orange? They're still going to be without Jefferson. They're still going to be without Cousins, Marcus Davenport. Darisaw, I think will there's a question mark about Darisaw, so that's something to monitor. But all 4 of those guys were out Sunday, and it didn't matter. I think it'll matter this week, but the question is can you get yourself to -3 with the Saints? I don't think so. Some good questions here. Sean Donahoe, situational, dumb brain question. San Francisco is probably a more desperate team. Does it matter in a spot like this? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the problem is that I don't think that Jacksonville is out of the woods either. Jacksonville at 6-2. You have Houston at 4-4. You have Indianapolis, who has been playing well and who's favored on Sunday morning. Like, I don't think that there's that much pressure off the Jaguars. And in fact, I think if you look at, okay, who has more pressure on them, I'd be more afraid, frankly, of Houston with how well Stroud's playing to come up and catch, especially, especially with an easy schedule. Houston is one of the easier schedules coming up. I'd be more afraid of Houston or Indianapolis catching me if I were the Jags than I would be of San Francisco catching me if I were, if Seattle catching me if I were San Francisco. Masses, Darius on no injury designation. That's great. I do think that there have been some surprising injury things with Minnesota this year. Davenport in week 1 being one of them. So just FYI. Dan Bodine asked, what's your take on Dallas minus 17? I got it at minus 16.5. Like, look, that's a lot to lay in an NFL game. But I do think Dallas is kind of the team that will cover a number like that more readily than they'll cover a +3 against a team like Philadelphia, even without playing them. I have been a person who has defended Mike McCarthy at times as somebody who has worked with him in the past on stuff at PFF. But that end of game sequence in Philadelphia by the Cowboys was really, really hard to stomach. And, if you had +3 in that game, my hat's off to you. How D has a good question, and this is probably better answered by a professional. But going back to San Francisco -3 trend, you referenced something akin to read the market. Don't you think after a few minutes of market steaming, the current market fair price should be Markovian? I tend to agree. I tend to agree with that. I mean, I think that the issue is, I agree with you. I think that the issue is this all comes down to make your own number on a game. If you make a game 2.5 and the market steams it to 3, then you have to go and back test situations like that, because, like you said, most of these market moves are random walks to an extent. But there are obviously the closing number is much sharper than the opening number. So there is signal in market moves, but to try to predict them or why they happened, or, whether it was a head fake or something like that, that's all kind of folly, I think. So it's a good question. My thing is again, like, it's more from the perspective of, let's say you like a game, let's say you make it 2 and the market's sitting at 2.5 and you're waiting for 3. You have to think about like the reasons why it got to 3, when it got to 3, who's betting, the kind of, who would be betting to make it that way, and then make an informed guess and ask yourself if what your model is missing, or what your handicap on the game is missing, because you are always missing something, and whether or not you think people are overreacting to things that you haven't accounted for or have accounted for differently. But that's a really good question. Okay, let's talk this one. This one's interesting to me. Green Bay, Jaire Alexander, as well as Quay Walker are both doubtful, but Green Bay goes to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh off of a bye, Green Bay off of a win. This thing, depending upon where you look, and I'm going to refresh a little bit here, just to refresh the screen a little bit here. Anywhere from 3.5 in that game. It's really hard for me to think about the Steelers in a spot where, the Steelers have to basically extend and win by a touchdown-ish or more. Obviously 4, they can win by 4 and cover that number. But this is a Steelers team that in the Tomlin era has simply been a better dog than they've been a favorite. And even at home, covering as a favorite has not necessarily been something that Mike Tomlin has done over and above expectations. Especially in recent years. I think that they're much more suited to be, to play a team that's fundamentally better than them and muck it up and keep it in the game than the opposite, which is kind of what you're going to see here. Now, the question is if you're going to back Green Bay, is like, do you think that and right now the number's 3.5 points bet -3 at DraftKings, depending upon where you want to look, whether you like the favorite or the dog. I tend to lean Green Bay here just because I think that, they're going to muck it up, and they do have some players in Aaron Jones, Christian Watson, that can make some plays. Watson's been banged up, but I think he's going to play in this one. Whereas I don't know if the Steelers, I do know Jaire Alexander being out matters, but I don't think the Steelers have like sort of the facilities to make up for, to make another team pay when it comes to secondary injuries. So, this is a game that I think is going to be condensed. And as such, if you're getting more than a field goal with the underdog, it feels smart, even though, again, the Packers have defied kind of all logic this season. The Steelers have defied all logic this season. In LA, the Detroit Lions, and like just to think about this, maybe like a couple of years ago would have been patently idiotic, but the Detroit Lions are going on the road against the Chargers. They are laying a field goal. Now it's a cheap field goal, minus 3.5, sorry, minus 3 plus 100 at Superbook. Is it to think that the Detroit Lions could go on the road to a team that's had 2 straight winning seasons and be favored is very interesting. But I think that they kind of, I make the number -3. So I think it's fair. I don't think that I could advise either side of this one. I do think that the Chargers are getting healthier in some important spots. Joey Bosa is getting healthier. The Lions are getting healthier as well, with somebody like David Montgomery coming back to sort of sledgehammer that Chargers defense that's sledgehammerable. This is a big game for the Chargers with respect to the playoff race. If you look at sumersports.com/league-table, when you look at playoff probabilities, the Chargers going into this one are at 32.8%. So you're talking about a team that at 500 has a lower chance of making the playoffs than the Steelers and the Browns and the Bills, the Bengals. We have them projected to win 8.8 games. When you look at schedule strength down the stretch, you're talking about a top 10 most difficult schedule in the NFL. And with respect to the AFC, only Buffalo, Las Vegas, Kansas City, Baltimore, they have a tougher schedule than the Chargers. So it doesn't get much easier from here. I think that they really miss a downfield threat. I think with Mike Williams out from a contested catch standpoint, from Josh Palmer out from the deep threat standpoint, like I just don't know if the Chargers have the firepower to take advantage of the Detroit Lions defense the same way they would have maybe a few years ago. And, to me, that's really going to be a tough thing for them to overcome. The Lions, on the other hand, they get obviously Jameson Williams is sort of, working his way back. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta have been great. And then they brought in Donovan Peoples-Jones, who I know has a little bit of a rib injury since coming over from Cleveland. But he can, have a kind of a Marquez Valdez-Scantling kind of effect on that offense in the sense of, being able to stretch the defense deep, even if he doesn't get that many catches. Khalif Raymond was kind of playing that role for them. And now I think it opens up Raymond, if you want to make the Chiefs comparison, to be more of the Mecole Hardman in that offense with that kind of speed, which is very real and something that really actually stresses defenses in the NFL. So that's going to be an interesting game as well. I already talked about Washington, Seattle. I do think that that's a game where, if we look at Seattle, they were getting money early in the week. Now you see some buyback on Washington. I think that Seattle's injuries have been really prohibitive to them. They've been prohibitive to, Geno Smith taking that next step. You have a hip injury for DK Metcalf, who's been mostly disappointing this year. The running back situation, they've kind of moved off of Kenneth Walker a little bit and on to Zach Charbonnet. Walker, as I wrote about in the article last night, has not been as efficient as some of the other backs in the NFL, the ones that, we all were talking about at the end last year when we talked about the 2 high shells and how hammering the ball up the middle on early downs is going to have more of a positive effect. There's not been the case for Seattle. Zach Charbonnet has taken over some of the carries and been okay. But to me, this is one about, look, both teams are going to move the football. And the question is who's going to be able to convert in the red zone, which is mostly noise, not entirely noise. It certainly depends upon how good the offense is. But it's mostly noise. And if that's the case, like, I don't know if you can lay all that many points with Seattle. So I understand the movement off of that 6 in some places. And I understand the move to the under. I think, very, very smart people taking that number. Sean has a good question here. Short number in Arizona. Are there more injuries to Atlanta? Well, I think this is what frustrates me about Arthur Smith and the Falcons is it's very clear that Kyle Pitts isn't healthy. Like, you watch the game. I went to the game the other day. It's very clear that he's not moving sort of the way that you would expect kind of a unicorn athlete of that ilk to move. So just say that, right? Like, just say, look, we're playing a lot of Jonnu Smith because Kyle Pitts isn't all that healthy. Like, you're not getting a competitive advantage by playing Jonnu Smith over Kyle Pitts. In fact, you're almost better off overstating how injured Kyle Pitts is. Same with Bijan. We haven't seen Bijan Robinson really do much since he was sick during the Tampa Bay game. Maybe there are long standing elements to that sickness that folks, that the folks aren't accounting for when they're doing their modeling, or when they're doing their fantasy football projections or whatever. But I think that there's real issues associated with Bijan Robinson's health, and obviously Drake London isn't healthy right now either. He missed last week's game against the Vikings, and so even if he does play, it'll be in a limited variety, I would guess. And so you have an offense that's featuring Kadarrell Hodges, Jonnu Smith, Tyler Algier. They have a good offensive line. I think that should be enough against Arizona. I do think Atlanta is probably a good place to look. Kyler Murray coming back is certainly something to be excited about if you're a Cardinals fan, but I don't think the Cardinals were playing good enough football to I think that I think that the Cardinals, it's exciting to get Murray back, but I don't think that they have the infrastructure to actually support him. I mean, last year Murray was the starting quarterback, and they had a difficult time winning. And I also think Murray off of injuries is always a little bit slower. Like every single year, 2020, 2021, 2 seasons where he started out hot and then playing hurt. He wasn't effective. I don't know he's necessarily playing hurt, obviously. I think that they've waited plenty of time for him to come back here, but that's just something to think about. Tommy David Walker says he's too worried about insulting fantasy football people. I actually don't think he is. I think he's frankly like thumbing his nose at them, and to a certain extent, which is a bit of a problem, right? Fantasy football pays a lot of his bills, gaming. The average person who plays fantasy or gambles, watches 4 times as much football as somebody who doesn't. So I think he should be a little bit more careful about who he insults. But yes, I agree that it's sort of a very weird situation. I think Atlanta is the only spot you can look that way. I don't think that the Cardinals are going to secretly have this great offense now that Murray is back. But also, their days of being the worst team in the NFL, I think, are gone. Even though they still do have the highest probability of getting the first pick in the NFL. One other game I want to talk about in detail before I take some questions. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat. Buffalo laying 7 against Denver on Monday Night Football. I think that Denver's been very popular this week. It's been bet down from an earlier number down to this flat 7. Maybe you see it get to 6.5, maybe not. Denver off of a bye, Buffalo off of Sunday Night Football in a game where they were basically handled by the Cincinnati Bengals. I still hold out hope for this Bills team. I know our ELO model makes them 3rd in the NFL. I think that's a little bit high. But I do think Josh Allen leading the NFL in EPA, total EPA. I think when you look at the markets where he's sitting kind of around 15 to 20 to 1 to win MVP, the Bills have the hardest schedule in the NFL moving forward. If you look at our website, I think that the Bills, there's going to be dichotomous. I think in terms of projection, I think there's a very real shot that they don't make the playoffs in the AFC, but I also think that there's a chance that he goes through this hard schedule, plays tremendous football, they win 10 or 11 games, and he could be a good MVP candidate by the end of the season, given where he's standing currently. Mass makes a point here. If Denver milks the clock like they did versus the Chiefs, I don't see how the Bills cover this number. Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I think that what you have to look for, which has been kind of reduced in the Russell Wilson 2020 version versus the 2022 version, is you need turnovers. I think that Denver, if they don't turn it over, you're right. I think that they move very methodically, move very slowly. Going to be hard for Buffalo to cover that number. But if this game paces up a little bit, I think that Buffalo. I don't think I can go just with a flat 7 on Denver. So I think that you'd almost have to lay it with Buffalo at this point. But I agree that the Bills at this point they've failed to cover in 5 straight games, I think, and it's been a wild ride for them. But I think that projections of the Denver Broncos kind of finding their way are maybe a little bit premature. I'll just say that. I don't necessarily think that they're coming on the same way that a lot of other smart people have thought. So that's those are the games that I kind of find compelling this weekend. Obviously, no Chiefs, no Philadelphia Eagles. They play in a week. I think Chiefs are -2.5 in that game. Jalen Hurts got injured the other day, but seemed to have come back and played fine. But those are the games that I find compelling. I wanted to get a few insights out there. Like I said, sumersports.com. The show with myself, the Sumer Sports Show with Thomas Mitroff and me, is every Monday and Wednesday. Stats and Schemes are with Sean Syed and Tej Seth on Tuesday. And then I'm not sure when the next one will come out, but when they do come out, they're on Thursdays. It's the Odd Man Front with Parker Fleming. A lot of good stuff. Go to Sumer Sports on Twitter. Follow us. We're almost to 12,000 followers. If we aren't already, we're about 100 followers away there. Tell your friends about our YouTube channel. We're almost to 3,000 followers there as well. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, comment. Thomas Dimitrov loves those comments, and please feel free to use our stats if you do any sort of content in your content. Just make sure that you cite us. So for Eric Eager, we have Dr. Tough Guy here. Any CFL takes for this Saturday? Okay, well, let me pull up the odds. I got to be honest, I handicapped these games, and then I kind of didn't look. Toronto's laying 10.5 against Montreal. That's the 3:00 game tomorrow. And then Winnipeg is laying 4.5 against Boston, or against almost said Boston College, BC, so British Columbia. Let me look. Last week, my numbers said that both favorites would cover, and that is actually what happened. So let me look. I believe I'm going to like Montreal ATS and then Winnipeg ATS, but let me make sure here as I pull up my numbers for this next week here on the CFL. It's pretty. I can give this away now. I make Winnipeg and Toronto basically equal on a neutral. I make BC about 3.5 points worse than Winnipeg on a neutral. So with home field advantage and a bye, I think I like Winnipeg in that one. I make Montreal about 1.5 points better than the average team on a neutral. So I make Toronto minus 8.75. So I think, and that's kind of where it opened, around 8.5, 9. So the market certainly disagrees and has pushed this thing out towards Montreal. So buyer beware. But I do make Winnipeg more like a touchdown favorite against BC. BC did a really good job and has at times this season. BC has really laid the smackdown on some teams that are inferior to it. Last week was Calgary, and they really just laid it on them a little bit. But I don't think the defense is good enough to stick with Winnipeg. And I also think Winnipeg is just, with Mike O'Shea, is really well coached. And Ollie Karen says, the Als, the Montreal, way too big. No showing for Winnipeg, which is big, but they do have Wolotarski, they do have Oliveira, they have a lot of skill position players. I'm forgetting what 10's name is, but they have a ton that can make plays. And so forth. Why hasn't every team done the punt first down thing? You have to have some open field to actually do that. And I think that while the field in Canada is pretty wide, I don't think it's something that is easily doable all the time, but a good question there. So I guess if I had to, be Montreal and be Winnipeg for me this weekend. And then I actually like Winnipeg. If you look at the futures market, I like them in a matchup with Toronto in the rematch of last year. I just don't think, I do think a lot of Toronto. I just think that Winnipeg, with their experience and everything, even though they did lose to Toronto last year, I just like Winnipeg. I think they'll be dogs in that game. So I'll take that. Awesome. Well, thank you for all the questions. Thank you for the activity in the chat. It's been a lot of fun. Have a great Friday, and we'll see you all next Monday.